Okay, we suggest that we start, and maybe the room will be filling up as we start speaking. My name is Pavel Hatsuk, and I'm the Deputy Head of the Human Rights Department at ODIHR. And I would like to welcome you all very warmly to this session, which is basically a continuation of the session from the morning. And we are going to focus on the social, economic, and cultural rights. And we're doing this because for many years we actually being absolutely frank with you, we hear many comments and many suggestions to work more with social and economic rights. And we do work with social and economic rights, but maybe not enough, just as the whole human rights community. Therefore, this whole day today is dedicated to the social and economic rights. And in the morning, we looked more in general at the particular challenges that the participating states and we all are going through, related to rising inequalities and the poverty, discrimination, and how this relates also to human rights. In this session this afternoon, we will be looking at a very particular area, and we would actually, I will straight away ask you to try and focus more on that area that is suggested for the discussion this afternoon, and this is the link between the social and economic and cultural rights and the prevention of violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism. This is a particular topic because we all, I think I can say that we all living in the shadow of terrorism. We all suffering when we hear about terrorist acts in the OSCE area. And therefore, and particularly as the participating states have the absolute duty to prevent terrorism and to deal effectively with the terrorist acts. And therefore, looking at social and economic and cultural rights is extremely important, because this is where we believe there's been a bit less stress vis-a-vis the more stress maybe on civic and political rights. So we are trying to close this gap also by looking at how the social, economic, and cultural rights are linked to the effective counterterrorism strategies. So what we will be looking at, particularly this afternoon, is basically like a twofold or maybe a two-focused approach. On the one hand, we will be looking at how human rights, how the social and economic rights can influence actually the strategies and can help the strategies to prevent terrorism or to prevent violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism. But then on the other hand, we would like also to focus on how actually the counterterrorism strategies influence or negatively impact the social and economic and cultural rights. And we very much hope that we will be concrete with examples, but also with good examples and good practices that will help us all, and particularly the participating states, to come up with effective strategies. I will also point you to specific questions that we have for this session, and some of them, just to give you an example of some of them, again, to keep us within the topic. How do measures aimed at countering violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism, adopted in the wake of the recent terrorist attacks in Europe, impact on economic, social, and cultural rights of the society? Do such measures impact on particular communities, individuals within the society? We already addressed in the first session the issue of gender. So hopefully this will also come back now, whether actually it impacts particularly women or children. So hopefully it will come back, also we come back in this session as well. Is there any safeguard in place for individuals affected by counterterrorism measures? Which gender-related consideration should be made when designing and implementing measures aimed at countering violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism? Do measures aimed at countering terrorism affect youth's economic, social, and cultural rights? So again, we will try to look also, and hopefully we'll look at the particular groups. And here I think also young people are the key. And talking about young people, I think, and I very much hope that you will also address the issue of education. be in itself a human right, because we believe that education is key in the strategies to prevent violent extremism and radicalization. A bit more on how we proceed. I really ask you and would like to encourage you to sign up for the speakers list here in the back of the head table, because so far we have only how many speakers? 13 speakers, which is again is a bit discouraging, because we all say that social and economic rights and cultural rights should be a focus of our work. I would also like very much to remind you that you can only take the floor in the capacity in which you are registered, because it's only entities registered on a speaker list that can be represented. I would also like to remind you that live streaming of this HDIM is available. Filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists. No other audio-visual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of individuals being filmed. I would also like to remind you that we expect that your interventions are presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner, so that you use the respectful language, but you also stick to the issue that we, or talk about the issue that we discuss here, that is on the agenda. Please submit your statements before the session to interpreters, and maybe also to the distribution, to ensure that flow of documents reflect the discussion. And the statements, please provide them to the documentation desk in front of the plenary hall. For that session, we have only one introducer, but a very great one and a very distinguished one. And this is, it's really my pleasure and honor to introduce you Dr. Anna Neistad. Anna Neistad is a senior director of research at Amnesty International. She leads and develops Amnesty International's global research agenda and oversees organization's crisis response. And Anna has been working with human rights for more than 18 years. She has conducted over 60 investigations in conflict areas around the world, including Afghanistan, Chechnya, Ukraine, Haiti, Kenya, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Syria, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. And prior to joining Amnesty International, she was Associate Director of a program at Human Rights Watch. And she holds an LLM degree from Harvard Law School and a JD and PhD in law. Dr. Neistad, the floor is yours for the introductory statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a crucial subject, and I'm very honored to be able to open this discussion today. And I think it is very important how this discussion is framed, that we are talking about essentially a vicious cycle of, on one hand, economic, social and cultural rights violations or failure to address these issues, fueling radicalization, violent extremism and terrorism, and on the other hand, both terrorism and counterterrorism measures contributing to inability of individuals to enjoy these rights. And I think it is very important to see it as a cycle rather than focusing on one part of it or the other. As just one general opening remark, I would emphasize one thing, that it is not the matter of choice anymore for states around the world. It is not even the matter of adhering to their international obligations. It is simply the matter of survival, if you like. We cannot expect our global efforts to combat terrorism, our global security objectives, to succeed unless we put concerted efforts into realization of all human rights, and that includes economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is basically what I will try to illustrate with some following remarks. I will start with the first part of this equation, namely the drivers of terrorism linked to economic, social, and cultural indicators. And first and foremost, I would like to say that it's a very complex question. It's a complex question for a research, for our research programs at Amnesty International or other human rights organizations. We're trying to invest more resources into it, but it's an equally complex question for international agencies. There is more and more effort to answer some of these questions, but there is also a recognition how complex and non-linear they are. However, there is already sufficient research and analysis that cannot be ignored, and that clearly shows that unless we start analyzing these drivers, unless we start understanding them, our efforts in combating terrorism and understanding where it comes from simply will not be efficient. In that respect, I would like to give a few very interesting findings from a report which was completed by UNDP very recently, just a couple of weeks ago. So I don't know if you've seen it already, but it's a very interesting report. It took 2 years to prepare. It was based on interviews with recruits in radical groups in Africa. It is obviously based on African context, but as I'm sure you'll find as I go through some of the examples from the findings, is equally applicable almost anywhere in the world. So, for example, just to mention a few things, and again, this comes from interviews with those who were recruited by terrorist and extremist groups in Africa. So here are the factors that the researchers found were mentioned as some of the drivers. One was the place of birth. The majority of recruits came from borderlands or peripheral areas that have suffered generations of marginalization. The other one that you would probably guess is education. But the numbers are interesting here. About 16% of voluntary recruits have 2 or fewer years of education, and about 39 have only 5 to 10 years of education. Another one that I found quite interesting is, on one hand, an obvious one, religion. Right? Obviously, many of the recruits cite religion, religious belief, religious conviction as one of the reasons that prompted them to join an organization. But what was interesting is when interviewed further, 57% of respondents admitted that they either don't read or have little to no understanding of the religious text or their interpretation. And this is a very interesting factor. So when we're talking about religion, we're not talking about their knowledge or understanding of religion per se. We're talking about religious propaganda. And of course, you know, when you think of how this can be used and incorporated into counterterrorism strategies, that gives you a very clear way forward. Then, of course, economic conditions. 55% of the voluntary recruits express moderate to severe frustration at their economic condition, with employment being the most frequently cited need at the time of joining. And finally, one last finding, which I think should sound as an alarm bell to pretty much all of us. It was an acute sense of grievance towards government. 83% of voluntary recruits believe that government looks after only the interests of a few, and 71% identified government action as the final trigger that motivated them to join their organization. something to think about. And I have to say that while of course at Amnesty we have not conducted such a massive research as UNDP was able to, just in our very recent work in Nigeria that I was part of, we came to very similar conclusions when looking at the factors that drive people to join Boko Haram, the organization that is particularly active in northeast of the country, but now even beyond Nigeria's borders. We found very much the same factors. The fact that it's one of the most disenfranchised and poor regions, lagging behind the entire rest of the country in social and economic terms, having the second highest rate of poverty, and with literacy rates almost 2 times lower than in the rest of the country. It is absolutely clear that these findings are first and foremost something that should be taken into consideration by the states themselves. But, and especially in this forum, I would emphasize that it is also clear that economic and social development, including through international cooperation and assistance, can play a role in reducing support for terrorism by preventing conditions, essentially, that give rise to violence in general and terrorism in particular. It has very practical implications for aid allocations, for example, and specifically budget allocations when it comes to, for example, programs to support counterterrorism efforts of the countries, where their effectiveness essentially would largely depend on to what extent they also take into account long-term structural stability. And I would use another few minutes to address, although it's a huge subject obviously, and hopefully we'll have more time to discuss it in the coming hours, but the issue of the impact of counterterrorism measures on economic, social, and cultural rights. As I said, it's a vicious cycle, and violations of rights fuel the resentment and discontent that, first of all, terror itself thrives on. And both the terrorism and the measures to combat it have serious negative effects on enjoyment of these rights. I will not talk too much about terrorism itself, but let's just be all very clear that terrorism itself, acts of terrorism, have enormous effect on enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, and economic development and social development, because they contribute to destabilization, to undermining civil society, to jeopardizing peace of security. And obviously, this phenomenon creates particular challenges for states who may already lack resources to address these issues, the systemic issues. I would just talk about a couple of examples of this impact, and I'm sure all of us can cite many more. First one is, of course, the diversion of resources. Quite simply, the resources, the moment the terrorism threat arises, the moment there is a commitment to combating terrorism, the resources that are normally allocated to social and economic programs and sectors such as education, health, water, sanitation, development assistance, poverty reduction, are being diverted in favor of security and counterterrorism programming. And obviously have negative access, it has negative consequences for the affected countries and communities. Discrimination is another factor that, of course, on everybody's mind. Here I would cite a finding or a statement from UN Special Representatives and Special Rapporteurs, a group of them, who essentially deplored the fact that under the pretext of combating terrorism, human rights defenders are threatened and vulnerable groups are targeted and discriminated against on the basis of origin and socioeconomic status, and in particular gave examples of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, indigenous people, and people fighting for their land rights, and again is the negative effects of economic globalization process. The other somewhat controversial example I would use is targeted sanctions. And obviously, you've heard my biography, you know where I work, so definitely I come from an organization that often calls for targeted sanctions as a way of addressing some of the human rights violations. But quite honestly, there is a caveat to that. And this caveat is that, on one hand, targeted sanctions can be very effective against individuals suspected of involvement in terrorist activity, if we're talking about freezing of assets or imposing travel restrictions. And they can be very effective. But currently, the targeted sanctions regime does pose a number of challenges, in particular related to lack of transparency and lack of due process. And these sanctions, let's be very clear, can have very serious consequences for the ability of not only the individuals, but their families to enjoy economic and social rights, impeding their access to education, employment, health, and what I'm trying to say here is not that we should not be using them, by all means, but that there are ways to limit the negative effect of targeted sanctions. Humanitarian exceptions would be one example, but most importantly that with this and any other measure as we implement it, we have to think through all of the potential negative consequences that it could bring with this. Another controversial measure that is becoming more and more common is construction of physical barriers to limit the movement of certain individuals. And there is no question that such measures affect the ability not only of certain individuals, but of entire populations to work and their rights to education, health, and family life. And we have, of course, multiple examples of that in our work. One that comes to mind is Israel, but Turkey and its counterterrorism operation in the southeast of the country, for example, against PKK, is also another example where counterterrorism operation resulted in very, very significant dramatic effects for the entire community when it led to forced evictions and displacement of these communities. In other words, in conclusion, I would just say that no matter how complex this issue is, there is a clear need to analyze the impact of any proposed counterterrorism measures on ESC rights, and to conduct this assessment, this impact assessment, in accordance with the interpretive principles in relation to economic, social, and cultural rights. In terms of some very specific things that could be kept in mind, there is not an exhaustive list, but in terms of some ideas that are being discussed currently in the international community, I would cite just a few examples from OECD key entry action points, which I think gives a good guidance in that respect. For example, they mention measures such as supporting community-driven development to build the capacity of communities to resist extreme religious and political ideologies based on violence. Help building effective and responsible media and public information strategies as powerful tool to prevent violence. Giving greater attention to donor programming to young people's job opportunities and education to prevent the emergence of fragile, disenfranchised youth. Increased focus on people transitioning out of poverty. I found this one interesting, not just on reduction of poverty, but on people transitioning out of poverty. And finally, striving to make globalization an inclusive process, which will help reduce support for terrorism. And that means not only increased aid efforts, but also greater policy coherence, complementarity, and consistency across the whole of our governments and within the multilateral system. In conclusion, I would note, citing OSCE itself, that a human rights compliant state does not pick and choose the rights that apply to it and must apply all human rights to all persons within its jurisdiction. History is littered with examples of the denial or partial application of human rights leading to conflict and terrorist acts. In turn, the counter-terrorism measures worldwide ultimately won't succeed if their implementation leads to the violations of human rights, effectively fueling the same problem that they're trying to tackle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neistat, for these excellent remarks. I think you gave very good examples also, and very, very good, you draw us closer to the discussion about the factors, about the good practices that need to be considered for effective prevention of terrorism, and I hope that we will be coming back to that as we speak, as we hear your statements as well. You also outlined some of the research that has been done, and I think it is very important for us to remember that research here is key. And I also hope that there will be some statements and some maybe feedback from the audience about any research in your countries that is available about this problem. We will be moving on now to the speakers, to your interventions. You will have, those of you who are signed up to the list, you will have 5 minutes for your presentation. And I would like to ask you to please introduce yourself before you start your presentation, your speech. Yourself, your name and organization, please. And please stick to 5 minutes, and if possible, we really ask you to talk about the theme that we are discussing within this agenda today. So the first organization on the list is the World Russian People's Council, followed by the Legal Information Center for Human Rights. The World Russian People's Council, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. I am pleased to address you again today, dear colleagues. My name is Marianna Vaskanyan. I am a coordinator for international information campaigns and programs of the World Russian People's Council. Now, the moderator has asked us in this session to concentrate on how humanitarian measures can be implemented to prevent our societies falling into extremism and radicalism. Well, is it at all possible to do that? Some might say that it is naive to think that this is at all possible, but I'm convinced that it is possible. And one of the areas in which we can do this is language. Knowing the language of one another, of other peoples, is a bridge that we can use to get to understand other people directly. I am sure that most people in this room master several languages. And that turns them into diplomats, not just when they're representing their governments around this table, but also in their individual contacts with people from different countries. And an example of humanitarian diplomacy actually working are examples that you can find in your personal life. I mean, for a number of years, I myself have worked on building dialogue between Russia and Germany. And my experience has shown that if I know some German and they know Russian, and I'm very grateful to the Institute in Moscow, thanks to which I was able to learn German, that really makes it possible for us to understand one another better, and it's a good foundation for dialogue. And in this regard, I think Russian has that function and has always had that function. If those colleagues who were present this morning saw how many people spoke Russian with very different views. They weren't necessarily all singing from the same hymn sheet, but that does open up more possibilities for communication when you know the same language or you have a common language. So we have contributed intercultural, interfaith, civil society dialogue in many different ways. And if you look at how we have made it possible for people to learn one another's languages, to learn one another's cultures, that really is something that opens doors. And if there were more and more such programs, such formats supported by the OSCE as an organization that would certainly want to contribute to that, well, we would also be prepared to help. Thank you.
You make. So please, the next speakers also make recommendations to us, to the participating states as well. So the next on the list is the Legal Information Center for Human Rights, followed by the Russian Federation. The Legal Information Center for Human Rights, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator, for having given me the floor. Participants, my name is Larisa Semyonova, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Information of Human Rights, Legal Information Center for Human Rights in Estonia. We're taking the floor here for the first time in this forum, and we would like here to speak about the situation in Estonia, where there are double standards with regards to political rights of representatives of national minorities. As a result of these principles being violated, they see their economic, social and cultural rights affected. At the moment, there are elections underway for local authorities. In accordance with the constitution of the law of Estonia, such elections are free, universal, equal and direct. And the results are based on the principle of proportionality. However, in this same law, there is a provision which runs counter to the principles I have mentioned. And this applies to Tallinn, the capital, where almost 1/3 of the country's population lives, and almost 1/2 of those are representatives of national minorities. The constituencies are defined by the capital's neighborhoods, but that does not apply with the principles I've mentioned, which do apply for the rest of Estonia. The situation for Tallinn is made in the specific provisions for that city. As a result, the number of seats required for the Russian area, Lasnamäes, is 6,000, whereas for the more wealthy area, Pirita, which is more Estonian in its ethnic makeup, only 2,000. So what the result of this is disproportional representation in power, and that means that certain parts of the population are not well represented, and many of those who are not well represented are members of national minorities. So their rights, political, economic, social and cultural rights, are not being respected. There's also a problem in the area of economic and social rights which arises for Estonian residents after coming back from Crimea in Russia. And that applies to issues relating, for example, certifying inheritance or changing passports. For example, in filling in the place of birth, you're supposed to put the country you were born. But if you were born in Crimea, you have to put Ukraine, whereas if you were born in the former Soviet Union, in what is now Estonia, you have to put Estonia. So the recommendation is that it's necessary to put an end to the double standards in elections and review the relevant article in the electoral law in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. I would also like to draw the attention of the international community to double standards in contested territories, as they are known, and ensure that those situations where there is ambiguity can be resolved in accordance with international law. Thank you very much.
The next one on the list is the Russian Federation, followed by USA. The Russian Federation, the floor is yours.
Mr. Moderator, dear colleagues, Let me introduce myself, Ksenia Trinchinka, and I represent the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. Now, the extraordinary intensification of migration flows, the economic and financial crisis in the world, the increase in the potential for conflict in the OSCE region have led to considerable changes in all walks of social life, which are expressed first and foremost in social tension and cultural compartmentalization of peoples. The new challenges in the area of migration have not only resulted in new threats, terrorism and extremism. We have these massive movements of peoples due to military conflicts, poverty, unemployment, and inequality of distribution of wealth among countries and regions, and these problems require urgent and global solutions. We have stressed on a number of occasions that civil and political rights cannot and must not be a priority. All categories of rights are equal and indivisible. One must not forget about such important issues as the right to employment, to holiday, to rest, to dignified living conditions, to do away with discrimination of workers by employers, social security for vulnerable groups of the population, including the poor, the disabled, orphan children, support for young families and single parents, pensions for the elderly and for the disabled, the right to health care and medical treatment, protection of the family, of maternity and of childhood, and many, many other such issues. Now, in these fields today, there are serious problems in the great majority of OSCE participating states. We consider that the institution of the family requires particular protection, for the task of the family is not just to reproduce the population. It is the glue among generations. It is the element that bears the social structure, and it is fundamental for the development of society as a whole. The family is interested in the preservation of economic, political, social, and demographic sustainability of the state to the same extent that the state is interested in having strong families. And it is only thanks to such an approach to the family that the family and the state can become genuine partners of building a better future together. And it is just as important to pay greater attention to cultural rights. This relates in particular to the right to education, the right to teach, academic freedom, the right to create, protection of access to cultural values, participation in cultural educational programs, support and development of cultural contacts among individuals, and preservation of the cultural heritage. All of this is enshrined not only in key international documents, but also in many of the OSCE commitments that we have all taken on board, starting with the Helsinki Final Act. Furthermore, in 1991 in Krakow, a separate important document was adopted on these issues. It is important to improve attention to the preservation of the right to parents to ensure religious and moral education of their children in a way that is consistent with their own convictions. This is an important factor that is crucial not only for harmonious development of the child and the family, but also for ensuring stability in the society as a whole. And in many countries of the OSCE, there are serious violations of the right to participate in cultural life and to life, and also the right for minorities to use their own languages. In Ukraine, they often exploit the argument of so-called Russian imperial ambitions, supposedly a threat to neighboring states. Here we have Russia that wants to expand on the pretext of protecting Russian language and the rights of Russian language speakers. But these arguments are absolutely absurd, and it is through such insinuations that Ukraine is trying not only to cover over its ill will when it comes to ensuring rights of language minorities as a whole, but also to draw attention away from its deliberate policy to push out the Russian language, to erase our common culture and history. Now, we would like to note the following to our Ukrainian colleagues who from time to time speak in Russian, showing this as a demonstration that everyone speaks Russian. But the fact that they know the Russian language is from a previous time. They obtained their knowledge of that language when it was taught, and now this is something that they are trying to bring to an end. Now, unfortunately, the authorities of Kiev are today depriving children of Russian language families to have the right to be educated in Russian, a right that they themselves could take advantage of. And we call on participating states seriously to take up these problems and to demonstrate, not just in words, but in deeds, that they intend to ensure respect for social, economic, and cultural rights of all citizens, including the possibility of being educated in one's own language and to preserve one's culture and one's convictions. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Terrorism and violent extremism must be addressed from all perspectives, including the economic, social, and cultural. But we should not and empirically cannot associate terrorism with any one race, religion, nationality, or civilization. As Secretary Tillerson has stated, terrorism manifests itself in many types of organizations. Historically, there are many drivers of violent extremism. There is no single or predominant pathway. Our experts judge that poverty per se is not generally a driver of support or sympathy for violent extremism. Poverty is often negatively associated with support or sympathy for it. Violent extremism also often thrives on justice deficits and governance gaps. Perceptions of inequality do seem to matter. The perception that one's ethnic or religious group is systematically marginalized, discriminated against, or threatened, for example. Recruiters amplify and exploit grievances. Few violent extremist recruits are motivated solely by money, but they can be motivated by the desire for respect and prestige. Fostering alternative pathways to respect and prestige requires more than swift injections of cash or short-term skill building. It demands long-term opportunities that satisfy the need for belonging, identity, justice, and status. Fundamental freedoms empower those countering violent extremism. Respect for human rights permits the growth of healthy political processes that give youth hope and an ability to lead in shaping their future through all peaceful means. Conversely, when governments violate human rights, they foster grievances and undermine security. Inclusive societies that respect freedom of expression, assembly, and association and provide equal opportunity in the economic, social, and cultural spheres are key to countering radicalization and to violence. This includes the ability of individuals to disagree with one another peacefully and with civility. My delegation condemns violent extremism and rejects xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. We strongly support freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief, and we oppose invidious discrimination in economic, social, and cultural spheres. These values are not mutually exclusive, but strongly complement each other. In a related subject, it is important to uphold the long-standing practice of HDIM of giving NGOs an opportunity to air their views, whether popular or unpopular, sympathetic or offensive. Last week, a number of delegations, as well as ODIHR, expressed concerns regarding presentations made by several NGOs. We should do more than dismiss these statements for not adhering to OSCE principles and commitments. We believe it is incumbent upon us as participating states to respond substantively to their assertions. By doing so, we may be able to inform the thinking of wider audiences. We don't want to play into the false narrative that here at HDIM, participating states exempt from criticism certain practices we condemn or propositions with which we agree. Despite the time restraints in which we operate, a range of opinions can and should be heard. That does not mean they are equally persuasive. We would like to make two key points. First, ascribing to an entire group the views or behavior of a minority of the group is not only unjust but counterproductive to countering violent extremism and promoting tolerance. Second, we reject the suggestion that the international community ignores violations and abuses of human rights when they are purportedly justified in the name of religion. Many countries in the OSCE, including the United States, object to this relativist view of human rights. For example, we worked to eliminate the practices of female genital mutilation and child early and forced marriage, regardless of whether some attempt to use religion, culture, or tradition to justify them. Likewise, many countries are working hard to combat or justify any effort to justify violence against LGBTI individuals on any grounds. We've had discussions here of the reported campaign against gay men in Chechnya. It's also important to point out that the ideas enunciated in the Cairo Declaration of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation have been used by some governments to jail their political critics and opponents on religious grounds. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S. and many other countries have challenged such anti-democratic and anti-human rights efforts in international fora with notable success. In conclusion, we should not ascribe responsibility to an entire religious group for the abuses of some of its members, but we must also make clear that human rights, whether political, civil, or economics, cultural, or social or cultural, are universal and belong to all members of all groups. Asserting that human rights violations and abuses are justified on religious or cultural grounds does not get you a pass, it gets you condemnation. We believe that if we advance these principles, we will make progress in addressing the drivers of violent extremism. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on the list is Switzerland, followed by the European Armenian Federation for Justice and Democracy. Switzerland, please, the floor is yours.
Merci. Je m'appelle Laurence Trumont.
Thank you very much. Laurence Trumont. I work for the political section of human rights at the Department for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Moderator, Switzerland would like to thank Ms. Anna Neustadt for her excellent presentation. Preventing extreme violence is one of the priorities of Swiss foreign policy. It's part of our commitment to human security and violence prevention. And in order to emphasize the importance of this, Switzerland in 2016 developed a plan of action for foreign policy on preventing extreme violence. This is based on the action plan of the former UN Secretary General, who recommended that states to promote social, economic and cultural rights. Through specific projects and programs, Switzerland is committed in combating social, political and economic exclusion by facilitating access to the labour market for young people in particular. It wants, in so doing, to establish a social context where nobody is tempted to resort to violence for economic or social reasons, or to fall prey to violent extremist recruitment. Young people need to believe that they have a future and they have alternatives, and we welcome the OSCE's chairmanship's efforts to strengthen violent extremism prevention by focusing particularly on young people. Switzerland is working on the ground to ensure that young people have the possibility to go to school, get a job and earn a living. And that's something that will happen if we improve basic education and also vocational training while creating jobs. Since 2012, more than 300,000 people have benefited from such vocational training. Switzerland, in doing all this, wants to contribute to fighting terrorism through prevention by increasing building capacities and the resilience of communities and individuals. We need to address the root causes, the structural and direct causes linked often to denying cultural identity and the lack of hope in the future and a lack of economic possibilities which are experienced as unfair. Mr. Moderator, we also want to promote the role of women as stakeholders in terms of local activities, but also in terms of forming policy in the area of human rights and the prevention of violent extremism in line with the priorities of our plan of action. We are supporting the annual Forum Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, and we call on participating states to promote the gender dimension in all of their efforts against extremist violence. Finally, my delegation would like to underscore that the responses and the prevention to radicalization need to be part of a broader holistic approach which achieves greater inclusion of all community members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these examples, Switzerland. I invite next the European Armenian Federation for Justice and Democracy, followed by the human rights movement Birdu Noy Kyrgyzstan. The European Armenian Federation for Justice and Democracy, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Herina Evinyan, representing the European Armenian Federation for Justice and Democracy, EFJD, a grassroots organization with members in 14 European countries. Our members are volunteers, European citizens of Armenian origin. In other words, the main resource of the EFJD are active European citizens who want to be involved in the democratic processes in their respective countries and advocate for issues they care about. One of the main goals of the EAFJD is to break the ongoing isolation of the population of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh imposed by the authorities of Azerbaijan for more than 25 years by all possible means. No conflict has been solved in a sustainable way through marginalizing the people who are directly affected by it and without speaking to them or listening to them. Yet, unfortunately, this is exactly what the Azerbaijani authorities have been striving as a matter of principle. Politicians, foreigners visiting Artsakh are put on the so-called blacklist created by the Azerbaijani authorities and are demanded to apologize. There is no relevant document of international law that would justify this approach. Because of Azerbaijani pressure, students can be barred from participating in education programs in Europe because they happen to be from Artsakh. The allegations of Azerbaijan on the so-called illegal nature of economic and other activities in Artsakh lack international legal basis and are aimed at justifying a policy of collective punishment of the population of Artsakh. In fact, international law does not recognize any limitation over human rights of individuals or groups based on the status of the country of their residence and contains no discriminatory provisions in relation to the non-recognized states. According to the international instruments, in particular the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the realization of individual and collective human rights and fundamental freedoms, including economic and social rights, must not be dependent on the status of the territory where peoples live. Moreover, the UN Covenant on Political and Civil Rights and the UN Covenant on Economic, Social Rights and Cultural Rights empower people to pursue their economic, social and cultural development by the virtue of the right to self-determination. The UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, by its Article 1.2, establishes that, quote, all peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. Thus, the lack of recognition by other states cannot affect the ability of a state to engage in international relations, including carrying out foreign economic activity. The legitimacy of such engagement has been confirmed by international arbitration practice and recognized by international courts. Thus, the unresolved conflict cannot serve as an excuse for infringement of political, economic, and social rights of the population of Artsakh. We would therefore like to invite you all to a side event, a film screening to take place tomorrow, September 21st at 6:30 p.m. in room number 2. It is a documentary with the title The Besieged, on the life of the people in Nagorno-Karabakh right after the bloody war erupted. The debate will be followed by a debate with outstanding speakers. Refreshments and drinks will also be provided. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is the human rights movement Birduino Kyrgyzstan, followed by Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy. Birduino Kyrgyzstan, please, the floor is yours.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon, Birduino Kyrgyzstan. In recent years in Kyrgyzstan, we have seen a substantial decline in the economic, social, and cultural spheres. In 2016, we were 120th on the index, the social index, and 136 when it comes to corruption. There have been a rising social tension. Some 1 million people have gone to work in Russia and Kazakhstan because of high unemployment. Some 30% of the population is below the poverty line, and changes in the social sphere has also had a big impact on the possibilities for the civil society to influence decision-making. The entry into the customs union have made it possible for our authorities to copy the anti-constitutional legal changes introduced by the Russian Federation already. And these trends have had an overall impact on the deterioration of the situation in the country with radicalization of the society and a loss in certain values. There is more violence in the society, and the most vulnerable are women and children, the former often subject to sexual harassment and exploitation. And under these circumstances, my country must take special measures to give more economic opportunities to women on the job market. And we must bring down the mortality of mothers and young women. Now, when it comes to the right to equality and non-discrimination, certain measures need to be included in the legislation in accordance with ratified conventions. Discrimination against women and national minorities must be combated, and there is also discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation, which is unacceptable. We need a new law on equality and non-discrimination, and I appeal to the authorities to introduce that. Legal procedures do not also meet international standards. There is not equal access to justice. Once again, the most vulnerable in this respect are women and children. At all stages of legal proceedings, the forces of law and order should treat victims in a respectful manner in accordance with the recommendations of the Committee to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. Kyrgyzstan has received more than 600 recommendations from the UN Committee, and we would, of course, refer to the need for a plan to be drawn up for the implementation of these recommendations. They should be done jointly with the OSCE Center in my country. More than 180 people find themselves in places of deprivation of liberty on charges of extremism and terrorism. 7 of them are women. And there are 4 factors. There's the lack of knowledge of religion, poverty, political instability, belonging to religious organizations, irresponsibility of religious teachers, violation of rights, and distrust in the institutions of the state. Those have been identified as the root causes of this growing extremism. Thank you.
On the list is Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy, followed by Krasnaya Vesna Information Agency. Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy, please. The floor is yours.
Mr. Moderator, participants of this meeting, thank you for the opportunity to make a speech. My name is Nariman Ustaev, and I am Director General of Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy, Ukraine. The long years of genocide of the Crimean Tatar people by Soviet regime had created threats for identity of these indigenous people of Crimea. Therefore, I would like to speak about the cultural rights of the Crimean Tatar people. The first, one of the tools for preserving the national identity of the Crimean Tatars people is the Crimean Tatar language and its transition into Latin script. This transition is also determined due to political motives, since the Cyrillic was imposed to the Crimean Tatars in Soviet times. With an aim of a comprehensive overcoming of the consequences of the genocide of the Crimean Tatars, it's necessary to make into account this important component of language policy. The introduction of Latin script will facilitate the mental unification of the Crimean Tatar people, including the diaspora abroad. The second, speaking more about diaspora, I would like to underline that representatives of the Crimean Tatar people, who are citizens of Turkey, Romania, and many other states, formed multi-million Crimean Tatar diaspora. Taking into consideration the importance of interaction between Ukrainian authorities and representative structures of the Crimean Tatars with the diaspora of the Crimean Tatars people, it's necessary to create effectively mechanism of interaction with Crimean Tatar diaspora in Ukrainian legislation. In this context, we propose to envisage in Ukrainian legislation that diaspora of the Crimean Tatar people is a community of citizens of other states or stateless persons who have Crimean Tatar ethnic identity. The third, last but not least, Since the beginning of time, Islam is a pillar upon which the social, political and legal relations in Crimea have traditionally been built, thanks to which the Crimean Tatars people were historically formed as a nation. Therefore, we believe that it's very important to make into account religious and ideological considerations and to envisage in Ukrainian legislation provisions regarding holidays of the Crimean Tatar people, namely Oraza Bayram, Ramadan and Kurban Bayram, the main holidays of Islam. We are confident that this will be an unprecedented expression for respect for the Crimean Tatar people and other Muslims in Ukraine. And all this can help the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty after temporary occupation of Crimean Peninsula by Russia Federation. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is Krasnaya Vesna Information Agency, followed by Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Krasnaya Vesna Information Agency, please, the floor is yours.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, my name is Maxim Zhelenkov. I'm a civil activist from Germany, and me and my colleagues have been studying a number of questions, including the workings of social policy and the German Jugendamt, and how the care of children of this service is carried out. The handling of children and the practices in the social services is something that we've looked at over a number of decades, relating to the removal of children from homes. And that has enabled us to understand what kind of results the family policy has resulted in. It was initially identified as a positive policy, but unfortunately today we can say that this policy in practice leads to very negative outcomes. It effectively destroys family and has an extremely detrimental impact on children. It violates the rights of parents and children to be together. It's a question of violating the child's right to be with their parents and the rights of parents to bring up their offspring. But in many cases, the family relation is seen as a threat to the child. What happens also is that social workers are taking decisions on the future of children on subjective criteria without effective monitoring by the authority responsible. There is very little monitoring of the Jugendamt. Let me give you a few figures, and this comes from the Federal Statistic Office of Germany. Relating to preventive measures from 1990 to 2015. In total, in 21 years, 7,000 children were taken. You can say that 627,972 children over that period of 21 years have been taken by the social services. Now, this relates to 2013. So in 21 years, almost the whole generation has been through the juvenile services. I have a lot of statistics, but I think that figure of 720,000 is perhaps of children taken from their family is the most important. One of the main reasons for taking children from their homes is the acts of the parents, and this is 2013. In Germany, the risks are seen from different forms of social behavior, doubts about whether parents can bring up their children in important developmental stages, psychological diseases of the parents, psychological illnesses, and there are other categories as well as cruelty to children. So in speaking with German human rights defenders, we find that it is in that category that most of the removals take place. Sexual violence is responsible only for 1.5% cruel treatment for more. But if you look at the media, the claims are that it is often sexual abuse which is the cause. That's a misrepresentation. So quite often we see measures where, in a large number of cases, children return home to their original home. So you have to ask the question whether the psychological damage that's done to children through removal is actually worth it. German experts say that children suffer greatly from this process, and it's only something that can be allowed if there is a real case of potential damage to the children, but that's certainly not the case in at least 40% of cases. So what we have here is a legally authorized violence against the family. It's very difficult for families to prove that they are not guilty. There is very little objective monitoring and very little social control. So the rights of the social services are enshrined in law, but actually what this law does is removes the protection of families from the state itself, even though that's something which is a principle enshrined in the Constitution. What would we recommend then in light of this situation to OSCE countries? Firstly, pay greater attention in their meetings to family policy, social policy, and children's policy, and also change the family policy in those countries where children and their families are presumed guilty rather than innocent, and also create the legal framework which makes it easier for families to stay together, making it a lot more difficult for such social authorities to remove children without strict controls. Thank you.
Is Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, followed by All Russian Parents Resistance. Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ahmad Shahidov. I represent Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is a multilateral treaty adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on 16 December 1966 and in force from 3 January 1976. It commits its parties to work toward the granting of economic, social and cultural rights to the non-self-governing and trust territories and individuals, including labor rights and the right to health, the right to education and the right to an adequate standard of living. I would like to focus your attention on one country. While the citizens of this country are the part of Europe, some of their fundamental freedoms have been restricted. The right of these people to move freely, the rights of athletes, musicians and the art of representatives to demonstrate their talents abroad have been violated. These people have long been facing political, economic, cultural and social embargoes for many years, and these embargoes were applied by only Europe. The only reason is that they are Turks. Today I want to speak about the Turkish community of Cyprus. There are 2 de facto states in the island of Cyprus, and some of the economic, social and cultural rights of the Turks living in the island are not recognized, and the consequences of the long-term embargo policy are contrary to fundamental human rights. The island of Cyprus covers a small geography. In the island there are 2 states that have been one country in 1970 and have been separated later. I do not want to talk about the political aspects of the problem here, because I am a human rights defender and I am interested in the rights of people there. Today, a number of fundamental rights of ethnic Turks living in Cyprus are being violated. Turkish athletes in Cyprus cannot freely participate in international competitions. Turkish musicians in Cyprus are facing obstacles in demonstrating their talents. Direct flights to the northern part of the island have been blocked. Turkish businessmen in Cyprus cannot trade freely. I can keep continuing like this. I also want to inform you that the Republic of Cyprus does not respect international law and migration agreements. I want to raise a problem that I faced in February of last year. So here is a representative of the Republic of Cyprus, and we all know that the Republic of Cyprus is a member of the European Union, and it's also a part of the Schengen zone. So it's possible to visit the country with Schengen visa, but this is not the case for everyone. I want to share my own experience. So in February 2016, I got a ticket from the Warsaw to Larnaca, Cyprus, and after crossing all the border procedures, I sat down on the plane. After about 4 hours, I reached to Larnaca, and I was shocked at the sight I faced at the border crossing point of the Republic of Cyprus. When they saw that I am a citizen of the Republic of Azerbaijan, armed men took me to a room. They began to act rudely against me. After a while, I thought that I am a human rights defender and did not violate any international or local laws. They became somewhat calm. Also, I have a Schengen visa. They said that Azerbaijani citizens have to come to the Republic of Cyprus with a special Cyprus visa. And they have sent me back to Warsaw again on the same plane. Do you imagine it? I returned to Warsaw again for 4 hours by the same plane. As a passenger, my rights were violated, and it violates the Schengen Agreement, which is a member of the Republic of Cyprus. This process continues today as well. I'm addressing to the ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus here. I may understand your relations with Turkey, but what is your problem with my country, with Azerbaijan? You are talking about tolerance and together living, and I ask you, is that your tolerance? And if you are united with the Turkish separate community tomorrow, will you show the same?
I was asking all of the speakers to specifically pay attention to speak about the topic of this session, please.
I have ended my speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next on the list is the All Russian Parents Resistance, followed by the information agency Regnum. The All Russian Parents Resistance, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I represent the organization All Russian Parents Resistance. I'm called Zhana Tokmamedova, and I want to talk about the false priorities of social policy with regard to families on or in OSCE countries. These priorities have developed as a result of a campaign to counter violence against women and children. Now, obviously, that's a serious problem which we all need to fight against, and it's certainly not a false priority. But when it comes to discussing such violence against women and children, that very quickly turns to a discussion on domestic violence, and the fight against domestic violence often turns into a fight against family violence, which ends up in a fight against the family, because the family gets accused of being the greatest source of violence. The media then discredits the family, and the figures that we've heard about sexual violence in families have become a pretext for interfering in family life, applying greater controls. There are different means of doing this. First of all, using a distorted picture, using figures that really don't exist to justify strengthening controls and laws, repressive laws relating to our families. Let me give you an example. In Russia, children's rights campaigners often say that 1 in 5 children is subject to sexual abuse in families. Now, it's funny that we hear the same figure, 1 in 5, from the US, from Israel, from France, etc. It's quite strange, given the very different cultural and family situations in these countries. People say that in Russia, 20% of children in Russia are subject to such abuse, but there really is no serious research. The statistical sources amongst Kazakh, French and Russian campaigners are based on the figures of the Parliamentary Assembly and the Council of Europe. The figure has been given as 1 in 5, and that's recommended by the Council of Europe. It was a campaign which has had a real effect on social public opinion, impacting policy in a number of countries. And at the heart of this campaign, there's been a fundamental effort to convince people that 1 in 5 children is subject to such sexual abuse in families. But we haven't been able to find actual figures in Russia. So we've looked ourselves into what the actual situation is. And when we looked into the situation of national statistics, we discovered that there was a huge gulf with the Council of Europe's figures. The figures differed 1,000-fold at least. Let me give you an example. In 2012, crimes against children in Russia totaled 84,558. And that's all crimes against children, not just sexual ones. So that includes theft of mobile phones, being attacked on the street, many theft of food, etc. Could you keep to the subject at hand? Yes, we're talking about social policy, and well, our subject is prevention of extremism and radicalization. Yes, well, I'm talking about social policy. Yes, of course I will. And what does that mean? Well, social policy defines the society, and a society in a country it has an impact on the culture of presence of violence or absence of violence. And going back to these figures, it turns out that only 0.03% of children have been subject to such abuse within the family. So where do we get these figures where we hear constant talk about the violence that children are subjected to within families? Some people might say that statistics don't take into account the hidden violence, but where then do these figures of 1 in 5 come from if these acts are hidden? You cannot make policy on the basis of mythical figures which are not available to anybody. We all understand that sexual violence against children is a very serious pathology which is extreme. We understand as well that the government defining its social policy on the basis of such extreme pathology is assuming guilt, applying the principle of guilt to each family. Please come to your conclusion if you can. Thank you. So coming to the conclusion, what I would say is that very often these crazy figures are floated with regard to families. We've looked into it. We found out that the way that it's being done is that the actual definition of violence is being extended. Psychological violence, ecological violence, cruel treatment, psychological, all of this really impacts on the way that parents can bring up their children. And if families are being found to violate this broadened definition of violence, they can be removed from families. So it's necessary to look at figures in the OSCE, carry out social research, and review family policy with regard to families. Thank you.
Спасибо. I would like to remind again all the speakers to please respect the format of this event and really stick to the topic that is on the agenda today, the link between economic, social and cultural rights and the prevention of violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism. The next speaker on the list is the information agency Regnum, followed by the information platform Global Rights of Peaceful People. Information agency Regnum, please, the floor is yours.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I represent the Russian information agency Regnum, and I am a freelance correspondent for that agency in Spain. I, too, would like to stress the importance and the need to discuss within the framework of the OSCE the social and cultural policy applied to families, mothers and children, which should not be marred by market relations. And that is an appropriate role for the social state. And let me demonstrate this on the example of the defense of children in Spain. Spain, like many other countries, ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989 and adopted a law to protect children. In 1983, when many functions were transferred to the autonomous communities, all of the structures of the Frankist women's patronage, which made it its business to kidnap children from unreliable mothers for many years were transferred to the autonomous administrations, the archives, the budgets, the structures, and the organizations. Now, these archives in democratic Spain have not yet been opened, and parents and children are still forcibly separated from one another. It is estimated that the system of choosing mothers this way, which acted from 1950 to 1990, resulted in the kidnapping of about 300,000 children. Thousands of letters have been sent to the European Parliament pleading for measures to be taken. A special commission was constituted. It visited Spain on the 22nd and the 23rd of May under the chairpersonship of the British Euro parliamentarian Judith Curtin-Darling. On the 30th of May, there was a hearing in the Spanish Senate at which the representatives of groups of parents once again announced that the 1990 did not bring an end to the kidnapping of children, except that today this is being done on the basis of some legal decision. Now, taking into consideration all of the details, it's quite logical to observe that, in fact, these new entities that are taking children away from families are simply the heirs of these Frankist structures. Now, this requires an expenditure of some 4,000 to 8,000 euros per month for each child from special EU programs, as well as from state and municipal funds. So this really means that this is all being done on the basis of market relations. Please, says the moderator, could you please indicate the link between this and radicalization or extremism? Well, it's because these children then find themselves in these social networks. I mean, it's really a prohibition against parents raising their own children, and they're taken away from marginalized families. But I would like to continue to make my point, if I may. Now, in order to be as profitable as possible, this business has to be dirty, and it is dirty. Families are provided with the so-called services, such as having their children taken away because of poverty. And very often the financial vulnerability of the family, the fact that the family is in a marginalized group, is the pretext for the child being taken away. That is unacceptable discrimination. A market for children has been created, and this market imposes on all of its participants to act on a market basis to maximize profit, which has nothing to do with the rights of the child or the best interest of the child. And it's children are put into foster families, kept there, and then subsequently adopted by others. And a policy to protect families has been replaced by turning children into a market good. And this is particularly difficult to withstand by single mothers or even ordinary families with two parents who simply have empty pockets. These children are collected in centers where they are subject often to exploitation, to pedophilia, and the members of Islamist organizations and other sects work in these centers, and then they orient these children towards the commission of extremist acts. So in connection with this, I would recommend that measures be taken to help natural families, the biological families, financially, socially, and culturally, so that they can raise their own children, so that families be kept together rather than be destroyed, and that there not be this attempt to foment hostility and competitiveness within the family by taking children away, and this can result in children being taken up by various extremist groups. Thank you.
Your right to freedom of expression. But I think it's important to respect each other's time, but also respect the framework of this meeting. So please speak about the topic of the agenda. The next, and I would also like to remind you that those of you who would like to speak still, please sign up, because we have only 4 speakers on the list left. So the next speaker on the list is the information platform Global Rights of Peaceful People, followed by People's Assembly of Kyrgyzstan. The international platform Global Rights of Peaceful People, please, the floor is yours.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Thank you, moderator, dear experts. I'm the president of the International Platform Global Rights of Peaceful Peoples. I was elected in February in Munich, and the platform has already existed since 2006. Now, I've been here since the 11th of September. Here we're at our 16th session. I've made 6 statements. The statement I'm going to make today is called The Threat to the Academic and Cultural Rights of the Ukrainian Society with the Banderization and the Fascization of Power in Ukraine. Now, yesterday, in discussions with various peoples in the corridors throughout this period, I've noted that what is being said by our experts, of course, it's very needed, it's very necessary, it's very much to the point, but it's not always what concerns us most. I mean, to appear in a suit and tie is all very nice. I've decided to be a bit revolutionary and to speak before you today in jeans and without a tie. But in Central Asia, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine, in our committee, we also have French representatives, Italian representatives in our international platform. And it's very easy to defend human rights in countries where they are not violated. But who takes the floor here? For instance, Veronica, she lives in Switzerland. She is from Kazakhstan, and she talks about violation of rights in Tajikistan. I mean, I live in Milan. I lived previously in Madrid, and I talk about Ukraine. But everybody has to go sooner or later to their home country for a wedding or for a funeral. Yes. Could you speak to the subject, please, says the moderator? Well, the recommendation is that we set up an internal office of ODIHR for the protection of people from being imprisoned when they speak at the HDIM meeting. I mean, a lot of people come to the HDIM meeting, and every now and then they go home for that wedding or for that funeral, and sometimes they get 10 or 12-year sentences. That's what I've been told. And I think it would be appropriate that this be done by ODIHR. I think it's within the terms of reference of ODIHR. It would be necessary to set up a special unit to which individuals who come here and speak to HDIM could appeal when they are being subsequently charged in their home states. Now, the director of ODIHR is from Iceland. Now, in Iceland, of course, as we know, is a country where in 2004 a comedian became the president, and Iceland was a drug-dependent country, and then it became... Yes, could you return to the subject, because you just have a few seconds left. Well, the subject essentially is the following. We are recommending, as a civil society organization present in Europe, we are calling on ODIHR to set up a unit for the defense of the physical integrity of speakers who speak to HDIM, who come to HDIM, and subsequently are charged in their home countries. Thank you. Thank you.
It is to that as a person who worked for many years in ODIHR and spent many years, I've seen many speakers speak. Indeed, we are concerned about such cases of people being persecuted for speaking at this event, and we are following up on these cases. So it's an important recommendation for us, and I think it's important to speak about these issues in this forum, so thank you for raising this. The next speaker on the list is the People's Assembly of Kyrgyzstan, followed by the Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety. So People of Assembly of Kyrgyzstan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mamitov Talkon is my name. I represent the People's Assembly of Kyrgyzstan. Colleagues, individual negative processes which have already been talked about by my colleague are taking place in a number of countries, including a number of countries represented here. The evaluation of the processes in Kyrgyzstan has to recognize the imbalances taking place, but these tendencies reflect what's happening in the world. Now, I'd like to thank the rapporteur turning to our subject. We've seen a good coverage of the reasons behind terrorism, and one of those reasons is lack of religious education, low level of religious understanding, and that's something which is certainly behind these problems. We draw equivalence between Islamism and Islam, and that is mistaken. I'd like to draw your attention to the need to identify clearly the link between extremism, radicalization, and the extreme forms of terrorism, and also draw your attention to radical fundamentalists preaching the need for a return to the fundamental religion. And that leads to radical methods. You cannot compare radicalism with traditionalism or conservatism. What conservatism is suggesting the preservation of things, caution. Traditionalism means recognizing the contribution of the past. Radicalism demands that everything be destroyed immediately and that everything return to the origin. So conservatism is about caution, radicalism is about destruction. So this kind of confusion needs to be avoided. Terrorism is violence based on killing and alienation. The fundamental causes for radicalization, terrorism, and extremism are low religious and cultural education, and also social economic problems. But there's also a social psychological aspect to the whole thing, and problems relating to individuals tending towards radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. I think that it would be appropriate to develop within the OSCE documents and studies that clearly reflect these issues. Kyrgyzstan would fully support that and involve itself right across the board, governments, NGOs, civil society, in developing an understanding of the socio-psychological aspects of terrorism, extremism, and radicalization. Thank you.
Remind the delegations about your right to reply. This is the moment to sign up on the list, because we only have 2 speakers left. This is the Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, and followed by Azerbaijan. The Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. I represent the Azerbaijani Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, and I'm continuing my activity to defend human rights in Azerbaijan, but not, unfortunately, within the country for reasons I've already mentioned. Now, in Azerbaijan, there is ongoing violation of the economic and social rights of citizens, not only when they are well-known critics of the regime, but even ordinary people. Today, for instance, in Azerbaijan, It is regularly reported that there is an effective system of social support for the population. But we receive daily complaints from citizens that this is implemented in an unjust way. When there is some assistance to be paid out, half of it is withheld by the local governments. And people who live in remote regions and are vulnerable and dependent, they have to agree to this, and they have to live on the remaining 50%. And those who try to insist on their rights have the entire support payment taken away. Why, in such a rich country, do we have 2 million people who have left the country to work in Turkey, Ukraine, or the Russian Federation? And of those who are still in the country, 30% are under the poverty line. Well, I can give you some statistics. Over the last 12 years, in Azerbaijan, some $150 billion has flowed into the state treasury. Some 20 remains, and 130 has been spent on all sorts of programs, supposedly to support the vulnerable and to develop the economy. But in fact, 50 billion have left the country. You can't build a socially just society and to guarantee equality with each receiving according to his needs and abilities when in the economy you don't have fair market relations, when everything is de facto controlled directly or indirectly by the president. And there's really only one way out of this, namely that the international community, and especially the trading partners of Azerbaijan, which includes most developed European countries, that they should take on board their responsibilities. And when Azerbaijan is claiming to ensure the energy security of Europe, they should not be obtaining in return some preferential human rights treatment from Western Europe. The Azerbaijani society is being destroyed by the Azerbaijani leadership, and many of our Western partners have not yet found the right way to help Azerbaijan to rebuild that civil society sector that is needed. There are 10 million people in Azerbaijan, but when yet another huge oil contract is being signed, and it's all done behind closed doors, and no one in the country knows the details, although this is extremely important for the country as a whole, well, we are confronted with a situation where the US, the UK, France, and Germany really must enact sanctions against the corrupt leaders who have taken full control of an oil-rich economy without offering anything to the man in the street whatsoever. This can inevitably result in radicalization of the society, which would be a pity. Now, as a representative of my country's civil society, I don't think that everything is lost. It is possible to introduce and implement programs that would weaken the radicalization trend, but that will require accountability vis-à-vis the people of Azerbaijan or the leadership, which means accountability vis-à-vis the people of Azerbaijan, of the major trading partners of my country. Thank you for your attention.
Azerbaijan, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Our statement will also address the statement made earlier by the distinguished representative of an Armenian NGO. It is worthwhile to recall Article 5.1 on the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, which stipulates that, I quote, "Nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights of freedom recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant." Frequent references by Armenia to Article 1.2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights distort the spirit and essence of the covenant. In fact, the article stipulates that the rights derived from the covenant should be exercised based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. The occupation is a temporary situation under international law and doesn't mean transfer of sovereignty. As such, the legislation of Azerbaijan is the only legitimate framework applicable to any economic, social, cultural, or whatever activity in the occupied territories. This was confirmed by the UN Security Council, which is in its relevant resolutions condemned the use of force against Azerbaijan and occupation of its territories, and reaffirmed respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and the inviolability of its international borders. The Council also confirmed that Nagorno-Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan, and it's clear that the target of this calls and demands is Armenia. It couldn't have been requested from Azerbaijan to withdraw from its own territory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have exhausted the speakers list, and therefore we are going to delegations now, to the right to reply. There will be 2 minutes for delegation, so 2 minutes assigned for the statements. And the first one is the Germany, followed by Cyprus. So please, Germany, you have the floor.
Ja, guten Tag. Ich möchte
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to respond to the representative of Krasnaya Vyesnaya Information Agency who spoke about the German youth office, Jugendamt, speaking about German children. I'd like to make a couple of points about the legal procedure in this area in Germany. With regard to guardianship, the well-being of the children is at the center of German family law. The temporary guardianship is a temporary measure where the child is separated from the home environment. And now this is undertaken in order to protect children from a potential danger. It should be noted that often it can be a child or a young person who wishes to take themselves into state guardianship. It's a measure which is subject to great consideration and also to prior checking that lesser measures might be possible. The situation after the state guardianship is initiated is one where a family court needs to decide whether or not the child can be returned to the family. The situation is monitored for solutions constantly. All decisions taken by the authorities are subjected to checking under administrative law and by the courts. And in the case of family law, this can be appealed directly to the courts. Thank you.
Thank you, Germany. And the next is Cyprus on the list, followed by Kyrgyzstan. Please, Cyprus, you have the floor.
Thank you. I exercise the right of reply in response to the comments made by an Azerbaijani organization for human rights. This meeting is not a platform for channeling political propaganda, state separatism, and historical revisionism disguised as human rights violations. Despite the Turkish invasion and continuing military occupation of the northern part of the Republic of Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus safeguards the human rights of all of its citizens, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Armenians, Maronites, and Latins. Hence, the Turkish Cypriots are entitled to the issuance inter alia of passports, and they can travel freely in the EU and worldwide. Furthermore, they enjoy social and health benefits, and the Turkish Cypriots have the right to participate in athletic events as part of the relevant Cypriot delegations. Some difficulties faced are the result and direct result of Turkish aggression on Cyprus, which keeps the country and its people forcibly divided. is not certainly the result of any action taken by the government of the Republic of Cyprus, which has the sovereignty over all of the Republic of Cyprus. As to the personal story of the representative, I would like to inform him that Cyprus is not part of the Schengen area. So the holders of passports of countries with which Cyprus has not established diplomatic relations, they are obliged to apply for a visa. Cyprus has duly informed the EU for this arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you. The next on the list is Kyrgyzstan, followed by Ukraine. Kyrgyzstan, you have the floor.
Thank you. The delegation of the Kyrgyz Republic would like to take advantage of its right of reply and to respond to statements made by Berdino, Kyrgyzstan. The information provided is not in accordance with reality. It is highly politicized. The government of Kyrgyzstan is implementing active measures to develop the socio-economic situation of the country in the last few years. And there have been some very positive economic trends. The joining of the Euro-Asian Customs Union has had a very good impact on the situation of migrant workers from Kyrgyzstan, and we have signed agreements with the Russian Federation about the possibility for Russians to work in Kyrgyzstan and vice versa without obligation to register for 30 years. Previously, it was only 7 days. Now it's 30 days. The Federal Migration Service of the Russian Federation states that some 70,000 Kyrgyzs had been put on a blacklist, but now, thanks to the new arrangements, the Federal Migration Service provides the citizens of Kyrgyzstan to cross the border in both directions without hindrance. Previously, they had to pass an examination in the Russian language. This is not something that is obligatory at this point. Previously, you had to have a foreign passport to travel to Russia from my country. Now this can be done on the basis of an internal identification card. As for education of children, it will be easier now for families from Kyrgyzstan to register their children in preschools and schools in the Russian Federation. And in accordance with that agreement, people can receive their pensions in whichever country they live in, even if it's earned in a different one.
Yeah. Ukraine, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. First of all, on behalf of the delegation of Ukraine, I would like to thank the representative of Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy for the proposals on the implementation of cultural rights of Crimean Tatars. They will be reported to the relevant authorities of Ukraine. Concerning the presentation and recommendations made by the NGO Legal Information Center for Human Rights Estonia, we would like to reiterate concerning so-called return of Crimea or возвращение Крыма, that the territory of Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol are occupied by the Russian Federation, and this is a flagrant violation of OSCE principles. So the representatives of the NGO should know about this. We also would like to, we also took note of the statement of the Russian Federation that is not really relevant to the topic of today's discussion, and we discussed this in some previous working session. But I, as Russian colleague from the Ministry of Education, decided to discuss some personal educational backgrounds. I would like to confirm that 8 million of Ukrainian Russians, to whom I personally belongs to, enjoy the same rights as the other citizens of Ukraine. Being the national minority, we can realize our right for education on our language, if we wish so. And at the moment, according to the information of Ministry of Education of Ukraine, there are more than 350,000 Ukrainian citizens studying in the schools with Russian as a language of instruction. And I would like to ask the representative of Ministry of Education of Russia, for 2 million of Ukrainians, how many schools they have? I can answer, 0. 0 for 2 million of Ukrainians. That's why we believe that the Russian Ministry of Education should better address the needs of the national minorities in their country. I thank you.
Thank you. The next on the list is Estonia, followed by Armenia. Estonia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am actually not going to comment on any of the issues raised here today, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank our introducer for her very insightful presentation, and you, Mr. Moderator, for your efforts in managing this. And I would also like to draw the attention of the participating states and participants to the Council conclusions on the EU external action on counterterrorism from the 19th of June 2017 that address several issues that we could have been speaking about today. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker on the list is Armenia, followed by Azerbaijan. Armenia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We also are very grateful to Madam Neustadt for a very interesting presentation. Before exercising of my right of reply, I would like to pose a question to her. For many often, the radicalization of youth is not stipulated by the basis of the radicalization is not poor economic conditions, and especially this is the case for Europe, when many young Europeans who traveled and joined terrorist organizations in Syria or Iraq, they were from very quite prosperous middle-income families in Europe. So I would like to ask you how you would comment this phenomena, and what should be done together with the economic measures to avoid radicalization of youth in Europe, because seemingly only economic measures per se, labor opportunities and so on, they are not enough to prevent radicalization. And I would like to exercise my right to reply to the delegation of Azerbaijan. We welcome attempts of the delegation to engage in dialogue with the civil society representatives. On the other hand, we did not hear arguments, though the NGO referred to a number of international documents which are legally binding. The point behind, I think, is that whatever conflict perceptions of different countries are, the social and economic rights are inalienable. The population cannot be deprived of these rights or sit and wait until the political disputes are solved. And we are concerned about the attempts of the Azerbaijani delegation to criminalize all economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian activities of the people of Artsakh, because such a policy is violating international OSCE commitments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next on the list is Azerbaijan, followed by Russian Federation. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to the intervention by the Freedom of Reports NGO, I don't know whether to thank my Switzerland-based civil society colleague of Azerbaijani origin or not for providing this periodic opportunity to use our right of reply and give our own opinion about the real situation on the ground. His statement, as many of his previous irresponsible statements, contain many claims and many accusations. None of them are new, and none of them are true, and none of them could be substantiated by facts or proofs. One has to be a mental acrobat to be able to transform the reality that is illustrated, for example, by the recent extension of the contract of censure with a BP-led consortium of transnational companies into what he referred to as shadow economy. We find it highly amusing and ironic that a person whose organization has been implicated in abuse of power and tax evasion, a case which is substantiated by proofs and facts that are also recognized internationally, is speaking here about the shadow economy. The Mickey Mouse shenanigans of his organization with financial reporting are well known not only to Azerbaijani law enforcement agencies, which duly investigated the case, but also to its international donors who finance their projects. Also, as a journalist, he should not be proud of himself for misrepresenting and distorting the quote of others. He claimed that the President Ilham Aliyev said in his interview, with quotations, "I do away with civil society once and for all." In his interview, President Aliyev said, and I have to switch to Russian in order to fully provide the content of the interview, and I quote, "Мы хотим сотрудничать."
We want to cooperate with those who do not interfere in our financial affairs. When there are attempts to interfere in our internal affairs, we take, of course, measures to cease such activity. Otherwise, we certainly want to cooperate with civil society.
We would like to reiterate that HDIM is designed to serve as a forum for constructive presence and positive opportunity for cooperative discussion and participation. We are disappointed that the so-called experts from civil society are once again allowed to misuse the forum and mislead the participants of this meeting with false and distorted information. That is not what the forum has been designed for. And in the end, the reply to the intervention of the Armenian delegate, since the time is out, will be made available shortly in the written submission. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is with the Russian Federation that will be closing the right to reply. The Russian Federation, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to use the right to respond to the delegation of Ukraine with regard to the rights of Ukrainian speakers on Russian territory. I would note that we do not have any high-density population areas of Ukrainian speakers, whereas there are high-density areas of millions of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Furthermore, we would recall once again that the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol are an inalienable part of the Russian Federation, and both of these parts of our country, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, are official parts of the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Well, by this we close the main part of the discussion. And I would like now to ask Dr. Neistat to make some final remarks, some final comments, maybe also reflecting a little bit on what you've heard, but also responding to the question from the colleague from the Armenian delegation. Dr. Neistat, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will be brief, but I will start with an answer, or I apologize, perhaps a non-answer to the question. And the reason it will be a non-answer is not because I don't have one, but because it would probably take another 3 hours. I did not attempt by all means to list all of the factors that contribute to violent extremism. I was very specifically asked and tried in my presentation to focus specifically on economic, social, and cultural rights related factors. There are, of course, many others. They're very context specific. And of course, the subject that you opened up is very acute for many European states right now. I do think that some of the factors that I mentioned are relevant for the recruitment of European nationals as well. If we look, in fact, there are already efforts to do this kind of surveys, and I would encourage OSCE to invest more in this type of research. But I absolutely agree that these are not the only factors, or at least they definitely do not describe necessarily the average profile of new recruits from European states. But again, unfortunately, that's a much larger discussion, and of course, I would very much encourage you to keep this discussion going, given the nature of this organization and the nature of the problem at hand. As concluding remarks, I would just reiterate that as several delegations as well as NGO colleagues highlighted, the socioeconomic drivers of terrorism are very similar, regardless of the context. It was actually quite striking to me that the NGO, the factors listed by the NGO from Kyrgyzstan were so similar to the factors mentioned in the UNDP report on Africa that I cited earlier. Which is something to obviously think about. But one of the key, if we were to find one overarching factor, it is, after all, an acute sense of grievance, often grievance towards the government. And both the government's failures to address the needs and the government's actions, and here we're moving more into the sphere of potentially political and civil rights. And basically it all comes down to the fact that unless these grievances are addressed, we will continue to play catch-up game when it comes to combating terrorism, responding to incidents or cracking down on networks leadership, and we will never win. I have seen it firsthand in places as different as Chechnya, Syria, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Uzbekistan, and many others. And I can absolutely assure you that putting off fires, be it one-off counterterrorism raid or years of civil war driven by anti-terrorist rhetoric, does not only entail massive human rights violations in and of itself, but also fails to at least achieve its declared goals, or in many cases leads to the exact opposite results. And let me conclude with expressing my hope that we see, given the nature of the organization, the mandate of the organization, as a body, and all of the member states will work towards developing not only a comprehensive action plan for the region that would address both the factors, socioeconomic factors that lead to, that serve as drivers to terrorism and violent extremism, but also the impact of counterterrorism measures that are being agreed and implemented on the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neistat. I would also like to invite the chairmanship in office for some concluding remarks in response to the introducer's comments.
Well, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you, Dr. Neistat, for this very good presentation and summing up. I just want to bring a short remark from the wider chairmanship perspective on this subject. As you know, we have made the prevention of radicalization and the fight against violent extremism leading to terrorism a priority of our chairmanship, and have therefore also, precisely for this reason, appointed a special representative of the chairmanship, Professor Peter Neumann from King's College London, in order to help us strengthen the focus on these issues within the and across this organization, and also for helping us formulating practical recommendations. So it might be of interest just to sort of briefly look at what he has been doing. He has visited a number of countries, field operations of the OSCE. He talked to institutions, and including ODIHR, of course. We have made a number of sub-regional workshops, particularly with young people, and he has been associated with those workshops. We have done a special roundtable at an informal meeting of foreign ministers in July near Vienna with Professor Neumann on this subject, so a kind of interim report to the political level of this organization. And now he's finalizing a study to be presented at the end of this month, looking at causes and triggers, but also at best practice he has gathered in this year, and making recommendations in this regard. So with this, we also hope that this will inspire preparations for the Ministerial Council in December, to allow a meaningful follow-up to this work, and I'm sure that the discussion here will also feed into those further activities. And with that, thank you very much, and thank you for this discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just maybe a couple of final comments. I found the discussion interesting, and I think I can conclude, easily can conclude, saying again, going back to Dr. Neistat words, that the issue we are talking about is extremely complex. And we were focusing, or we were trying to focus only on the economic, social, and cultural rights, but I think we all saw how complex the issue is, how, in fact, easy it is to look at any aspect of the economic, social, and cultural rights and link it to prevention of violent extremism and radicalization. But I think to be able to do that effectively, we need also research. And I think I will conclude by saying also that I think any effective counterterrorism strategy must absolutely take into account the respect for economic, social, and cultural rights, but also, of course, the civic and political rights. And I think I can also say that ODIHR from our side, we will continue working in this issue, and I also encourage the participating states to work more in this area. So I would like to conclude by thanking our introducer for being with us, for raising excellent points, for stimulating the discussions, the thoughts, some ideas, and maybe even follow-up action. I would also like to thank all of the speakers, all of the delegations, all of the colleagues and friends. I would also love to thank the interpreters who worked with us. So this is formally the end of the session, but it's not formally the end of the day, so we still have a couple of side events. Please visit those. And I would like to thank you all and wish you all a nice evening in Warsaw. Thank you so much. See you in the morning tomorrow.